Lucy Letby was convicted of attempting to murder one of her supposed victims, a little girl known as baby K, number 11, a baby who did ultimately go on to die, by deliberately dislodging her breathing tube and causing lack of oxygen and deterioration, ultimately to death. This was challenged the other day by the expert panel headed by Dr. Shu Li, and the essence of the challenge was the clinical deterioration was caused by use of an undersized endotracheal tube. They put in the expert panel headed by Dr. Shu Li, and the essence of the challenge was the clinical deterioration was caused by Lucy Letby was convicted of attempting to murder one of her supposed victims, a little girl known as baby K, number 11, a baby who did ultimately go on to die, by deliberately dislodging her breathing tube and causing lack of oxygen and deterioration, ultimately to death. This was challenged the other day by the expert panel headed by Dr. Shu Li, and the essence of the challenge was the clinical deterioration was caused by use of an undersized endotracheal tube. They put in a breathing tube which was too small, should have been size 2.5, and was actually size 2, which they lay out in the oral presentation and in the written document. This is a summary from the CPS, which doesn't include any mention of incorrect equipment being used. And this is the relevant pages from the Thirlwall inquiry, which also doesn't include any such mention. However, although we don't have a transcript of the case until we pay the apparent £100,000 that it costs, during the trial this excellent report was made on Reddit. Reddit might not be everybody's cup of tea, but all that matters at the end of the day is that it's accurate. And anybody coming to this matter on the basis of the expert panel the other day might think that this issue of the smaller breathing tube was coming out for the first time, but it absolutely wasn't. It was talked about entirely during the original trial. This is the relevant day, this is Ravi Jairam, and this is the relevant part. The initial intubation process is discussed. A doctor has 30 seconds to attempt the intubation procedure. The court hears the intubation was done on the third attempt with a smaller size 2 ET tube. He says ideally a 2.5 tube would be used, but in these circumstances a size 2 tube was sufficient. I believe this is Ravi Jairam taking full responsibility, assuming all this is correctly reported. On we go. Dr. Jairam said he was looking at child K, he disconnected the ventilator from the ET tube, and he tried to give breaths via the ET tube, but child K's chest was not moving. He doesn't seem to realise at this point that the problem was that the tube was too small. He said he switched into professional mode to resolve the situation, and it didn't make sense why the tube was dislodged. Rather bad choice of words. Professional mode should start the moment he signs on for his shift. He said he removed the tube, which wasn't blocked, and put a face mask to ventilate child K. Dr. James Smith re-intubated child K, and the same ventilator settings were selected, indicating Dr. Jairam tells the court child K had not been declining. The tube was removed, child K was bagged via a face mask, and SATs recovered quickly. A size 2.5 ET tube was placed. The size of the tube did not have an impact on the previous ventilation, Dr. Jairam tells the court, as child K was ventilating effectively and did not have an impact on the sudden deterioration. If it was the case that, in these circumstances, a size 2 tube was sufficient, why was it then that a size 2.5 ET tube was placed? Dr. Lee's panel had this to say about that. The clinical deterioration was caused by use of an undersized endotracheal tube. The consultant, that's Ravi Jairam, did not understand the basics of resuscitation, air leak, mechanical ventilation, and how equipment that were commonly used in the unit work, e.g. neopuff and capnograph. To put it starkly, they are basically accusing the consultant and the doctors of instigating the process which led to the little girl's death. Almost as an afterthought, there is no evidence to support a dislodged endotracheal tube, just in case you'd been distracted by all the above and forgotten that all of this was originally put at Lucy Letby's door, and technically still is, of course. So without any focus on the wrong-sized tube in terms of why the baby deteriorated and later died, they were left conjecturing about a dislodged tube. This was the nurse involved. Asked about her ET tube dislodged, removed and re-intubated, nursing note Miss Williams tells the court there was a query that the ET tube had been dislodged. The defence lawyer, Mr. Myers, asks if ET tubes can be dislodged if a baby moves or not. Miss Williams agrees. There was clearly doubt, but they seemed left with nothing else because there was no focus in terms of what led to the deterioration on the wrong tube, which was doctor fault, and only on an apparently dislodged tube, which was nurse's fault. There was no highlighting this apparently catastrophic decision, but in these circumstances a size 2 tube was sufficient. If there had been, they might not have been left reaching for speculative conclusions, but there wasn't. And going by the doctor on duty, it seemed to have been staring them in the face. Dr. Smith says he remembers coming back into the neonatal unit early on February 17th, probably for labelling blood bottles. He does not recall where the nurses were, but recalls Dr. Ravi Jairam giving breath to child K via the neopuff, and that was already underway. He said the readings, while unable to recall what they were previously, were not improving, and further measures were to be carried out. However, the explanation for a sudden deterioration was either the breathing tube being dislodged or blocked. Dislodged or blocked, but not too small, even though they did ultimately change the smaller one for the bigger one because it was too small. They didn't put the deterioration down to that.
Breaking news. a whistleblower reveals a car finance scheme affecting millions of drivers. This might sound
and bring her to justice, has told ITV News that hospital bosses took 2 years to alert the police despite consultants repeatedly raising concerns. Speaking exclusively to our UK editor, Paul Brand, Dr Ravi Jayaram said managers forced him to apologise to the nurse after he told them he suspected she was killing babies.
When babies started dying on Lucy Letby's ward, her colleagues never expected to catch a killer. But having saved countless lives in his career, Dr Ravi Jayaram potentially spared many more by stopping her. What was it like when babies started dying and you couldn't understand why?
I've been a paediatrician since 1992 and I had never in my career seen anything like this. And actually initially there was a feeling of thank goodness Lucy was on, because she's really good in a crisis, she's really good at managing these things. But as time progressed, the thought started springing into our heads. Could she be doing something deliberately?
So the thought starts sinking in that there could be a killer on the unit. I mean, that's a big moment.
It's a big moment and it's a chilling moment. I don't think anybody has a rule book for how you deal with a situation where you're suspecting that somebody's causing deliberate harm to babies on your neonatal unit.
In June 2015, after 3 babies died and another collapsed, doctors met with their managers and noted Lucy Letby's presence. 2 more babies would die later that year, another 4 collapsed, and by early 2016 there had been 3 internal reviews, but none of them came up with an answer, until something happened which made Dr Jayaram even more certain of his own theory. Tell me about the night when you walked in on Lucy Letby standing over the cot of baby K.
That is a night that is etched on my memory and will be in my nightmares forever, to be honest. I was sitting at the desk just outside the room writing notes, and the nurse looking after the baby said she was popping to the delivery suite to go and talk to the parents, and she said, I've left Lucy in there babysitting. Part of me was saying, you better go in and just check everything's okay, because you know what's happened before when Lucy's been on duty. As I walked towards the incubator, I could see on the monitors that the oxygen saturations, which is basically the baby's oxygen levels, were dropping. And they dropped to a level that ordinarily, number one, the alarms would have been going off. But number 2, the nurse would have called for help. And Lucy Letby was standing by the top of the incubator. She didn't have her hands in the incubator.
What was she doing then?
Well, she was just standing there. Now, tubes become dislodged. But this was a 25-week gestation baby. Will be in my nightmares forever, to be honest. I was sitting at the desk just outside the room writing notes, and the nurse looking after the baby said she was popping to the delivery suite to go and talk to the parents, and she said, I've left Lucy in there babysitting. Part of me was saying, you better go in and just check everything's okay, because you know what's happened before when Lucy's been on duty. As I walked towards the incubator, I could see on the monitors that the oxygen saturations, which is basically the baby's oxygen levels, were dropping. And they dropped to a level that ordinarily, number one, the alarms would have been going off. But number 2, the nurse would have called for help. And Lucy Letby was standing by the top of the incubator. She didn't have her hands in the incubator.
What was she doing then?
Well, she was just standing there. Now, tubes become dislodged. But this was a 25-week gestation baby who wasn't kicking around, who wasn't vigorous. The only possibility was that that tube had to have been dislodged deliberately.
The jury didn't reach a verdict in relation to that baby, but 2 more almost died shortly afterwards. Yet the next month, managers told doctors there was no evidence Lucy Letby was causing any harm. She was moved from night to day shifts, but when 2 more babies died and another 2 collapsed in June, this time consultants demanded a meeting with the hospital board, including the then medical director Ian Harvey and then chief executive Tony Chambers, to raise their concerns.
The very first thing that Tony Chambers, the chief executive, said to us, he cogitated for a few seconds and he said, well, I can see how that might be a very convenient explanation for things. And what that says to me is that he'd already decided that wasn't going on and this was us just trying to cover up.
He was trying to blame you, in other words?
I think so. He didn't say it explicitly then. We discussed having CCTV put onto the unit. We discussed her being supervised one-to-one with somebody watching her all the time. And then we heard that Lucy Letby had been moved to the Risk and Governance Department, so she'd been taken off the unit.
Suddenly, babies stopped collapsing, and the hospital asked the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health to conduct a review of the deaths. In redacted paragraphs we've seen, its report concluded that Lucy Letby was an enthusiastic, capable and committed nurse, that there was nothing about her background that was suspicious, and that concerned doctors had been going with gut feeling. Those doctors were summoned to another meeting with executives who now accused them.
We bullied her, we'd behaved unprofessionally, we'd behaved in ways that were unbecoming to the profession, and then read out a letter from her, which was a very aggressive letter from her, basically saying, I'm coming back to work and you have to work with me and I'm going to prove to you that I'm a great nurse and I'm not a killer like you say. And then Tony Chambers finished off by saying, so she's coming back to work, and this is the most chilling thing. I'm drawing a line under this, you will draw a line under this, and if you cross that line, there will be consequences for you.
You were asked in court, why didn't you just phone the police if you had concerns? But here is the chief executive of the hospital, your boss, saying, if you take any further action, there will be consequences for you. You have to draw a line under it. I mean, that must be an impossible position for you to be in.
It's an utterly impossible and a Kafka line, there will be consequences for you.
You were asked in court, why didn't you just phone the police if you had concerns? But here is the chief executive of the hospital, your boss, saying, if you take any further action, there will be consequences for you. You have to draw a line under it. I mean, that must be an impossible position for you to be in.
It's an utterly impossible and a Kafkaesque situation to be in as well. We were told when we initially raised concerns that if we call the police, there'll be blue and white tape everywhere, that's the end of the unit, it would be really bad for the reputation of the trust.
In fact, it was the killer who was about to turn complainant. Lucy Letby took out a grievance, with doctors forced to write this apology to her.
Dear Lucy, we would like to apologise for any inappropriate comments that may have been made during this difficult period. We're very sorry for the stress and upset that you have experienced in the last year. Please be reassured that patient safety has been our absolute priority during this difficult time.
Meanwhile, doctors continued to raise concerns, but Ian Harvey replied that there was no smoking gun and Lucy Letby would be returning to the ward, just as soon as Dr. Jairam had said sorry to her face.
It must have been an absolutely surreal experience to be sat across the table in that mediation session from somebody who, at this point, you're quite sure could well be a killer.
Yes, it was bizarre. And of course, to listen to her saying, I'm coming back next week, will you work with me? And of course, I was having to say, well, if the trust have deemed that you're coming back to work, I will work with you. Yes, but will you be happy to work with me? I will work with you if you're on shift. Because no, I wasn't happy.
She was just 6 days away from returning to the ward before management finally allowed doctors to meet with the police, after yet another review failed to explain all of the deaths.
The very fact that the police, after listening to us for less than 10 minutes, realised that this is something that they had to be involved with, to me speaks volumes. And I could have punched the air.
Do you think the lives of some of those babies could have been saved if management had taken action sooner?
It's a horrible thing to say, but I do genuinely believe that there are 4 or 5 babies who could be going to school now who aren't. It's a horrible thing to say, but I do genuinely believe that there are 4 or 5 babies who could be going to school now who aren't. Say. But I do genuinely believe that there are 4 or 5 babies who could be going to school now who aren't.
Nurse Lucy Letby could face new charges over more baby deaths and collapses at hospitals where she worked. Letby is already serving 15 whole-life orders after being found guilty of murdering 7 children and attempting to murder 7 others at the Countess of Chester Hospital. Natalia Hokara joins us now. Good evening to you, Natalia. Just tell us more about these alleged crimes then.
Well, this is all part of an investigation that goes back to 2023, well after Lucy Letby was convicted. Well, we know now that Cheshire Police had handed a full file of evidence to the Crown Prosecution Service. It relates to new allegations of baby death and non-fatal collapses, not just at the Countess of Chester Hospital, where Letby was convicted, but also at Liverpool Women's Hospital, where she worked and trained. It's all part of Operation Hummingbird, the police investigation into neonatal incidents dating back to 2012.
OK, and just talk to us about how this is different, how this is a different stage compared to what's come before.
Well, this is the first time that the CPS is formally considering whether to bring further charges against Letby. It follows a decision by the police back in March to widen the scope of their investigation. In a statement, the CPS said, "We will now carefully consider the evidence to determine whether any further criminal charges should be brought. As always, we will make the decision independently based on the evidence and in line with our legal test." There are no details yet on how many cases are involved or indeed how long this process could take. And it comes just a day after 3 former senior managers at the Countess of Chester Hospital were arrested on suspicion of gross negligence manslaughter. They've since been released on bail. Now, a public inquiry into how Letby was able to carry out her crimes is still ongoing, with its findings due in early 2026.
OK, Natalia, for now, thank you very much.
In developing news tonight, there is a big update in the case of a woman considered the UK's worst baby murderer. 3 senior leadership staff at the hospital where Lucy Letby worked have just been arrested. Our Europe correspondent John Paul Gonzo is in London for us. And JP, what have police said?
Well, according to investigators, this relates to the suspicion of gross negligence manslaughter. This is all over a corporate manslaughter investigation that was launched following the trial of Lucy Letby. Police say that this focuses on senior leadership and their decision-making to determine whether any criminality has taken place concerning the response to the increased levels of fatalities. Now, Lucy Letby was found guilty of murdering 7 babies and trying to kill 7 others in the neonatal ward of a public hospital in northern England. She is serving multiple life sentences with no chance of release. Now, importantly, police say this development does not impact those convictions, but it is going to bring up more questions about that trial and this case. A panel of medical experts has disputed the evidence against Lucy Letby. A lawyer insists she was wrongfully convicted. Even the former health secretary says this case should be re-examined. This is yet another traumatic case, a development in this case, particularly for those parents who had children involved in this. As for those 3 people who have been arrested, they have not yet been named and they were released on bail. Urs?
Thank you, John Paul.
Babies while working at the Countess of Chester Hospital is, according to one of Britain's most distinguished judges, probably innocent. Lord Jonathan Sumption has been reviewing the case, joins me live on the programme. Thank you very much indeed for coming on, Jonathan. What leads you to think she might probably be innocent?
The continual tide of expert opinion, highly qualified, which has emerged since the trial, which has shaken to its foundations the whole scientific basis on which she was convicted. Remember that there was no direct evidence against Lucy Letby, so that the whole prosecution case depended on constructing, sometime after the event, reconstructing events scientifically. And expert opinion since the trial suggests that a lot of that science was very questionable, and a lot of it was based on extremely questionable factual assumptions. I think you need to bear in mind that very premature babies are extremely vulnerable. The standards of neonatal care at the County of Chester, the Countess of Chester Hospital, were low. Deaths in neonatal units are very often unexplained. Now, the prosecution had to rule out all natural causes in order to sustain their case, but it doesn't seem to me that they came even close to that. Remember that of the 6 people she was accused of murdering, of the 7 babies she was accused of murdering, 6 were the subject of careful post-mortem examinations at a different hospital, Alder Hey, and 5 of those were found to have died from natural causes. The panel of distinguished experts assembled by Dr. Shu Lee has concluded, on the basis of the hospital notes, that death by natural causes, sometimes aggravated by unfortunate medical interventions by doctors, was the explanation in every single case.
Well, a lot of people will be hearing this, and we the Time took the press conference with Shu Lee, and we've spoken to some of those who've been involved in the building of that expert evidence. A lot of people will be saying, well, why wasn't either this heard at the original trial, and or, given that it wasn't heard at the original trial, how come there isn't another trial to hear that evidence, that side of the story?
Well, it's the responsibility of the defence of any criminal accused to assemble and call the evidence which they need in order to defend their client. Now, there are circumstances in which one decides not to call evidence. There may be tactical considerations. You may decide that you've made such a dent in cross-examination of the prosecution's witnesses that you don't need to call any witnesses. We just don't know. And remember that her defence team at the trial are bound by professional obligations which prevent them from explaining it themselves. So we shouldn't draw any conclusions adverse to them.
Should someone be able to have a retrial on the basis of the defence was, let's put it diplomatically and slightly glibly, having an off day, didn't do a very good job?
Well, there are circumstances in which the defence can be so unsatisfactorily conducted that will justify a further trial. But look, the Court of Appeal is understandably concerned that it should protect the status of the trial process by preventing it from becoming a mere dry run with another go later. And I see the force of that. But to my mind, avoiding injustice is a lot more important than protecting the status of the trial process. And the case that an injustice has occurred here is really quite strong.
So do you think a retrial needs to go ahead even if there is no, quote, new evidence to be presented at that retrial, that maybe the defence were so weak that this constitutes another go?
Well, I'm not saying that the defence was weak. I think that we can't say that until we know what their reasons were. But what is absolutely clear is that the failure to call evidence has, in fact, in hindsight, had very unfortunate consequences. Do I think that there should be a retrial? Yes, of course I do, because the prospect of somebody who may be innocent spending the rest of her life in jail and never having any hope of release is too horrifying to contemplate.
Is the process then of going about getting a retrial now left with the Criminal Cases Review Board? Is that all done too rigidly? There's not enough flexibility for them to be able to decide?
The CCRC can only refer cases back to the Court of Appeal if they think that there is a reasonable prospect that the Court of Appeal will overturn the conviction. And the Court of Appeal, well, they've got to guess, but the Court of Appeal is famously reluctant to overturn convictions, and that, of course, inhibits the CCRC in the cases it refers to the Court of Appeal. It refers less than 3% of all cases, and there have been some spectacular mistakes that they've made, notably in the case of Andrew Malkinson. So our system of appeals is extremely rigid.
Too rigid.
To my mind, that is very unfortunate.
Two very quick final ones. Do you think all this also sums up perhaps arguments for cases that shouldn't have a jury? It should be led by a judge?
Well, I think the advantage of cases being tried by a judge is that the judge has to set out his reasons, set out his analysis of the evidence in detail, and that makes it much easier to decide if a mistake has been made. Whereas juries don't give their reasons and can hardly be asked to. They may have 12 different reasons.